Let's take some time to look at a couple of songs now in more detail from the Let It Bleed period from 1969. The songs we're going to talk about are going to be Honky Tonk Women, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Gimme Shelter, Let It Bleed, and Midnight Rambler. Let's start out with Honky Tonk Women. I mentioned before that this was released as a single both in the US and in the UK, going to the top of the charts in both countries. You Can't Always Get What You Want as the B-side. Recorded at Olympic Studios in May through June of 1969. In case you're interested, the cowbell on this one, the characteristic cowbell that really kind of makes this tune happen, is none other than producer Jimmy Miller, the percussionist drummer, playing the cowbell on that. It started out, as I mentioned in the previous video, as a country tune. And that's the version we get, Country Honk, which, as I also mentioned, is not the original version of it. It's the one they recorded in the country style after they'd done Honky Tonk Women. But as Mick Taylor was coming in on these sessions in June of '69 and sort of sitting in place of Brian and that kind of thing as a kind of a studio extra, not unlike Nicky Hopkins maybe, he said, no, we should rock this tune up a little bit more. I hear it more like this. And so they did the kind of rocked out version. And that's what became Honky Tonk Women. So right from the very beginning, Mick Taylor having a certain amount of influence on the group. We hear Ian Stewart on piano on this particular one. Keith Richards is actually playing bass on this track as well as guitars. Now, there is a little bit of a controversy around Ry Cooder, the guitarist, who claims that he takes credit for the sort of guitar licks part of this, but Keith Richards says, nah, that's not true. But you may hear something about that with people talking about Honky Tonk Women in some of the derivation of the material. The form is a contrasting verse-chorus, so after that characteristic intro, you get a verse, a chorus, an instrumental verse, a chorus, and then a chorus that takes us out. The lyrics portray the singer as a victim of women, who these women almost take him by force. And this whole situation of sort of being sort of taken by these women that he doesn't really have much respect or regard for, it kind of gives him the blues. So he has the honky tonk blues here. This is obviously somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and it fits with many Jagger and Richards lyrics that portray the narrator as being reluctantly seduced by women, often on the road. If you look through some of the songs that came before this, some of the ones that we didn't get a chance too much to talk about the lyrics, and some of the ones that come after that, there is this theme they'll come back to again and again about, woe is me, poor rock star on the road, and all of these women just want to have me in a sexual way. Well, what's a boy to do? This kind of thing, And so this is another one of those kinds of songs. And they know that they're kind of putting you on when they say it that way. But there is a kind of a theme that they come back to, and this is one of those kinds of songs. You'd never think from the upbeat character of this tune that it's really about a guy who's depressed by the fact that he's being carried up the stairs by over the shoulder of various women and this kind of thing. The original lyrics, by the way, didn't have to do with Memphis and New York. I think there was a verse that had them in Paris and various other, but they decided to kind of turn it into kind of a southern boy kind of thing here with this version of Honky Tonk Women. So again, a classic Rolling Stones track, one of those ones that if you know 5 Rolling Stones songs, this is likely to be one of them. The flip side is a very different kind of song. If Honky Tonk Woman is started out as a country song and turned into kind of a country rocker with kind of tongue-in-cheek lyrics a little bit, You Can't Always Get What You Want is really a return to the kind of ambition of the psychedelic period and a continuation of that ambition. It was recorded first at Morgan Studios, then Olympic Studios, going all the way back to November of 1968. So this goes back to the period closer to Beggar's Banquet, but then they pick it up again in March of '69 and then April through May of '69. It features Al Cooper, Cooper spelled with a K, Al Cooper, not Alice Cooper of sort of I'm 18 and I like it fame. Al Cooper plays keys on this tune, both piano and organ, and also plays French horn. The French horn, interestingly enough, was overdubbed later at CBS Studios in New York. Cooper also played other horns on this tune, but then they didn't use the other horns that he played, and Cooper says he thought that was a good idea because he didn't think he did the tune very well. The story Cooper tells is that he was in London visiting with a friend of his. He was kind of on vacation. He didn't want to know anything about sessions. He'd been doing tons of sessions. You know, Al Cooper had been not only an active session musician during the 60s, but he'd been sort of the go-to keyboard player for Dylan since about 1965. He and Dylan spending a lot of time together, being very close and doing all the touring and sessions and stuff. So Al Cooper was very hot, a very hot call for sessions and stuff like that. So he went to London to get away from all that in New York, to kind of visit with friends and just kind of relax on what happens. But he gets a call to do this session for the Rolling Stones and ends up on this session. They also use the London Bach Choir and a choir arrangement done by Jack Nietzsche. So Jack Nietzsche is sort of still in the picture here on London. And then playing drums on this tune. Talked about Jimmy Miller playing cowbell on Honky Tonk Woman. Well, Jimmy Miller is actually playing the drums on this instead of Charlie Watts, because there was something that Jimmy Miller suggested in the drum part that Charlie Watts didn't feel comfortable doing, and so Charlie just said, well, why don't you play it? And so that's Jimmy Miller playing drums all the way through this. Now, it tells you something about Charlie Watts and the sort of lack of ego involved with that guy. The more you sort of hear the stories about Charlie, the more you realize how sort of undamaged by fame he was in certain kinds of ways. Well, there are two versions of this song. So if you go to listen to it, there's a version that starts with the choir, and that's the version you hear on the album. And there's the version that starts just with the French horn and the acoustic guitar, and that's the version you hear on the single. So try to hear the original version or the album version. Also, the mix is slightly different between the two versions. Same parts, but different mix. Now, of course, the use of the choir and the French horn makes a classical reference. And we've been seeing these classical references. The last couple times we've seen them come up, we say, is this a cue that the song could have something to do with Marianne Faithfull in Mick Jagger's eye? The idea that a lot of times when these classical references come in, they're in songs that really seem to be about him talking about a woman and his relationship. And of course, his relationship at that time was sort of crumbling with Marianne Faithfull. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's take a look at the form of the song, a contrasting verse-chorus song. The long version starts with the verse of the song sung by the choir, a cappella, just all by themselves. And then we get the intro, which features the French horn, as I said, played by Al Cooper, and then the kind of mellow verse-chorus. Things start to pick up as the band comes in. Another verse-chorus, an expanded verse, a chorus, and then an interlude, which has the choir coming back in, another verse, another chorus, and so the tune really sort of takes off at the end, and there's a kind of a big ending there that's just kind of almost kind of a rockin' classical choir rocks with rock band kind of deal there. It's also important to point out that in addition to the choir, the classical choir, there are a group of background singers who are singing more sort of in the gospel sort of soul kind of style on this tune. So you've got two kinds of background vocals, one a big classical choir and then one a kind of R&B singers. The lyrics once again address dissatisfaction. Remember, I can't get no satisfaction. We've talked about that dissatisfaction theme coming back. But this time they strike a more ominous note that links wine, blood, political demonstrations, and deception all together into a kind of toxic stew. Is this song about people allowing themselves to get the life sucked out of them by drugs and abusive relationships? And if they let it happen, perhaps they get what they deserve? Well, he doesn't say you get what you deserve. He says you get what you need, right? But nevertheless, the idea is that these kinds of activities people engage in thinking they're going to get one result, they get a different result. And the result they get maybe is not so good. This fits into the let it bleed idea, right? The sort of having the life or the ambition or something sort of drawn out of you, having the blood drained out of you. All right, well, let's move on to Gimme Shelter. This one probably most notable in the performance of Mary Clayton as the second singer in the group. I would say background singer, but she gets a fair amount of her own time on this track as well. Mary Clayton was recommended by Jack Nietzsche to the group and had worked with Ray Charles. Her vocals were added at Elektra when they were actually doing the mix down and the finishing off. Jack Nietzsche suggested, hey, we should get Mary Clayton in here. Well, who's she? Well, she's great. She's worked with Ray Charles. So they bring her in. She's a very schooled, professional person. The story is that she got through one or two verses and they said, that's great. And she said, yeah, before I continue, let's talk about how much you're going to pay me for this, right? So she understood that she didn't want to get exploited in this situation. Of course, there's a long history of African American musicians being exploited in the recording studio. Anyway, recorded initially in February, March, and then at Olympic Studios, and then Sunset Studios in LA, and Elektra Studios later in the year 1969. There's a story that the particular guitar tone that you hear on that, as a result of these amps that they were using called Triumph amps that provided a distinctive guitar tone, just as they were overheating, they would get this great sound, and that's the key to the guitar sound there. I don't know about that. Could be true, I just don't know about that. Note the percussion parts here, which really help establish the groove, and the great use of the harmonica in the tune, not really in a kind of blues way, but in an interesting kind of way. Maybe more reminiscent of what we'll later hear in some Led Zeppelin music. The form is a contrasting verse-chorus with this intro that uses the tremolo guitar, the backup vocals, the percussion, the piano, that little thing. Somebody can let us know in the forum what that little thing is called, but would you play with the stick that goes... Anyway, plenty of that at the beginning there. The form then goes verse, chorus, instrumental verse, instrumental chorus, and then they go through the chorus with Mary Clayton taking the solo, and that's really sort of her moment in the sun here, the verse and the chorus, and then the longish coda. The lyrics deal with revolution and blood in the streets. Remember the idea of Let It Bleed. It hooks up with the blood theme, similar to Street Fighting Man, which was another kind of revolution song, except this one doesn't advocate for revolution. It merely observes it and appeals for peace and understanding, whereas Street Fighting Man was, remember that one got banned from radio in the United States because they didn't need somebody talking about fighting in the streets during the summer of 1968 when there was fighting in the streets. But here, this is looking at that kind of thing happening and saying, what we really need is love and understanding and not this kind of blood in the streets. But again, thinking of the idea of Let It Bleed, that fits in with some of what we've been talking about, the concept of the tune. Well, we now come to the song, Let It Bleed, the title tune to the record recorded in the summer of 1969, June and July at Olympic. Features Ian Stewart again on piano. Listen at the very beginning, especially if you listen with headphones, you can hear Bill Wyman playing some very spooky sounds on the auto harp in the distance. Another thing I would point out is note how many of these rockers, these Rolling Stones rockers, are driven by strummed acoustic guitar. You don't usually think of an acoustic guitar as driving a hard rocking tune, but a lot of these Stones tunes, you've got Keith Richards back there really sort of strumming away on an acoustic guitar, in addition to the electric guitar that's going on. It becomes a kind of production kind of trademark for a lot of these Rolling Stones tunes, and Let It Bleed is one of those kinds of tunes. Layers of Keith guitars on this one of those where he would drive the engineers crazy, putting one guitar, trying different guitar parts until he got it just the way he wanted. A real stickler for that kind of thing. Not unlike Jimmy Page, who would come along later and be that kind of a layering guitars kind of producer. The form here, a contrasting verse chorus. You get an intro, then a chorus and a verse, a chorus and a verse, a varied chorus, another chorus, and then a coda, which is in a kind of extended jam on the chorus material at the very end. The lyrics, once again, address how we can depend on one another, though this can often turn to abuse and exploitation, maybe bleeding somebody dry. It ties in with the victim lyrics that we were talking about before, sort of the tongue-in-cheek honky tonk women, but this one much more serious, and it fits in with the blood theme. Marianne Faithfull has said that she suspected that she was the subject of at least part of these lyrics, and many people believe that the lyrics are filled with double entendres that describe various female body parts. I'll just say that much about it. I'll let you read it and use your imagination. Nevertheless, the song Let It Bleed really kind of fitting in with a lot of things that we've seen up to this point. And then we turn finally to the last song in this series of close-ups, and that's Midnight Rambler, recording again, started originally in February of '69, then again work done on March and May of '69, and October to November of '69, starting out at Olympic and then ending up at Sunset Studios and Elektra. Again, we hear layers of Keith guitars, plus some Mick Jagger harmonica on this one. The form is a simple verse. After an intro, you get a verse, a shortened verse, and then you get this interlude. In the middle of the interlude, there's an extended verse that's very dramatic, and then they come back and do a verse at the end, the way they had done it at the beginning. The lyrics deal with a serial killer. So again, we could think about things like the idea that there's blood involved, but here it's not the blood in the streets or the way in which we bleed each other dry through relationships or abuse or various kinds of things like that. But here it's literally a serial killer who creates blood by going around killing people. In fact, they even seem to be mentioning the Boston Strangler at various points in the lyrics. It's a kind of but it's very dark. It's kind of a cross between The Doors and Maxwell's Silver Hammer, although Maxwell's Silver Hammer I don't think had been released when this one was recorded. The interlude section is the interesting part. It's very loose and designed for live performances with changes in mood and tempo that incorporate this dramatic vocal section and a build-up to return to the last verse. The kind of thing you would do live, which is kind of, after you've done the tune, kind of break it down and then kind of do this dramatic thing, which, in person can be extremely effective, and then kind of build it up, get a little bit faster and eventually getting back to the original tempo again, right? So this is the inspiration. I think this comes from the soul and the R&B tradition of doing these kinds of things live. But what's interesting is that while it was inspired by live performance, the track ended up being very difficult for them to play live. They sort of did this live version in the studio and then struggled to sort of get it the way they wanted it when they played it live. It's a kind of tune that if you're in a band that plays every night, like in a club somewhere, after a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, you really have it down because the guys have done it enough times that they know, how to sort of pace it. But if you're just playing these big concerts and you haven't had a lot of chance to work on it live, very, very difficult kind of thing to get right. But I think that's where it comes from. But again, fitting in with our Let It Bleed a theme for the record. So that takes us through many of the songs from 1969. We need now to turn to the year 1979 or 1970. So let's do an overview of 1970 and the first live album that the Rolling Stones would actually take credit for, Get Your Ya-Ya's Out.